Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the National Council of Resistance of Iran, U.S. Representative Office. My name is Alireza Jafarzadeh, and I'm the Deputy Director of the NCRI's Washington office. Today is a big day. It's a day that, after some 40 years of state-sponsored terrorism, finally the Iran regime was caught and convicted by a Belgian court for its senior diplomat Assadollah Assadi for involvement in a foiled terrorist plot in June 2018. It's the first time that an Iranian regime diplomat was arrested, then tried, and then convicted in a court of law for terrorism. The very strong court verdict was in fact sentencing the Iranian regime for its state-sponsored terrorism. The Belgian court sentenced Assadollah Assadi, the Iranian regime's diplomat, to the maximum allowed, which was 20 years, and the other three culprits received 18 years, 17 years, and 15 years of imprisonment. The Belgian citizenship of all three culprits were revoked. So congratulations to everyone who has been concerned about the threat of the Iran regime and or interested in seeing a free Iran. Congratulations to all of you. We certainly have an excellent panel today to both go over the details, but also discuss what it means and what implications it has for the United States in crafting its policy regarding Iran. But before I briefly introduce my fellow panelists, I would like to mention that this event is broadcast live on our website, NCRI-US.org, as well as on our social media tools on Twitter at NCRI-US. We'll have our panel members to make their opening remarks, followed by the question and answer session. The media will have the chance to post their questions using the Q&A tool on Zoom or by emailing them to media@ncrius.org. Let me briefly introduce the panel members. We have Honorable Tom Ridge, former Secretary of Homeland Security and former Governor of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Governor. We're also joined by the Honorable Bob Torricelli, former Democratic Senator from New Jersey and longtime friend of the Iranian resistance. Thank you, Senator, for joining.
Thank you.
We have Ambassador Bob Joseph, former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, who's joining us. And also we have Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield Jr., former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Thank you, Ambassador. And finally, we're joined by Ambassador Mark Ginsberg, former ambassador to Morocco, former White House Middle East advisor for President Carter. Thank you, Ambassador Ginsberg, for joining us. And finally, joining us live from Antwerp, Belgium, is Mr. Farzin Hashemi from the Foreign Affairs Committee of the NCRI, who has also been into the court proceedings in December and just today as well. I must mention that we're also joined by our Zoom audience, hundreds of them joining us from all over the United States. These are the people, many of them were actually present at the 2018 Free Iran rally in Paris. Again, congratulations to everybody. But before we hear from our panel members, let me share with you a portion of the remarks by Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, the President-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, which she made after the Belgian court ruling. She said in her statement that today's conviction of the Iranian regime's diplomat-terrorist confirms the Iranian regime's state terrorism by a European judicial authority. The intelligence and foreign ministries and the regime's embassies were directly involved in this plot. The time has come for the European Union to take action. Silence and inaction under whatever pretext will only embolden the mullah's regime to continue its crimes and terrorism. She also added, the Iranian people expect that the EU revise its Iran policy and hold ruling theocracy accountable for terrorism. the flagrant violation of human rights, the massacre of political prisoners, and the mass killing of defenseless protesters. After today's historic verdict, the Iranian people and resistance expect the EU and other European countries to undertake the following steps, which are vital to dismantling the regime's terrorism network in Europe. Number one, recall their ambassadors from Tehran and shut down the regime's embassies and centers in Europe, which are used for terrorism. The mullah's foreign minister must be held accountable for the confirmed role his ministry and embassies and political diplomats played in a major terrorist crime. Second, the entirety of the Ministry of Intelligence and the IRGC must be designated as terrorist entities in Europe. All their agents must be prosecuted and expelled from those nations. Europe must not grant refugee status or nationality to those agents because they use them for terrorism and espionage. Three, prosecute the Iran regime's leaders who are responsible for these terrorist activities. They must face justice. As she said, any negotiations with the regime and the return to normal diplomatic status must be conditional on dismantling the mullah's terrorist network in Europe. She said firmness is the correct answer to the mullah's blackmail and hostage-taking. Otherwise, they will continue this sinister policy. The mullah's regime is under the mistaken impression that the era of international accountability has ended. The Iranian people and resistance will not rest. And she concluded by saying they will never forget that the terrorist plot, the crimes against humanity, and the execution and mass killing of prisoners and the protesters. So with that, let me go to Antwerp, Belgium, and start with my great colleague Farzin Hashemi, who actually testified, as I said, before the court on behalf of the National Council of Resistance of Iran back in December, and was also present at the court today when the verdict was announced by the judges. Farzin, please go ahead and fill us in with the verdict and your thoughts about it. Please.
Thank you, Ali Reza, and it's an honor to be with such distinguished panel. As you just said, I had the opportunity to be present during the court proceedings, during the trial, both in November and December. And I also had the opportunity to read throughout the 15,000-page file, which had been prepared after 2.5 years of investigation by the Belgian judiciary, police, and authorities. As it was already said, this was really, today is a historic day, and we saw a historic judgment by the court in Antwerp. I say it was historic because over the past 2.5 years, the Iranian regime tried hard and took every measure that one could imagine to prevent this trial. First, they tried to take legal action by asking for immunity for Assadollah Assadi. They failed in Germany when they rejected or they opposed extradition of Assadi to Belgium. Then when they arrived in Belgium, he again asked for diplomatic immunity. The case went as far as the Supreme Court of Belgium, and it was rejected, but they never gave up. Simultaneous with that, there was diplomatic pressure on European governments. And when that didn't work, Assadi himself threatened the investigating team that if he's convicted, there will be terrorist activities against the interest of Belgium. And indeed, today the judge referred to this statement by Assadi. So apparently that's one of the, or is part of the ruling that they see one of the defendants has gone as far as even threatening with terrorist reprisal if he's convicted. When that didn't work, they took another measure, and that was taking hostages, some of the dual nationality who have been imprisoned in Iran. And in the last few days, when the trial was to start, they announced that one of them is going to be executed. So everything was planned to exert maximum pressure on Belgian authority and the judiciary to prevent the trial. And indeed, yesterday, the day before yesterday, there was a parliamentary debate which the Minister of Justice acknowledged that there has been call from Iran for exchange of prisoners, which they had rejected. And today he, again, in response to the reporter, made a strong position saying that Belgium is a country governed by the rule of law. And we are not going to, and this is a terrorist case, and they have been rightly condemned and convicted. And this sent a very strong message to those who involved in such activities. But as just Ali Reza said from the position of Mrs. Rajavi, really what the court said today was confirmation that what we are facing is a state terrorism. And I want to emphasize on that, because as you all know, for many years, there has been this false notion that the terrorist activities attributed to the Iranian regime are the work of rogue elements or this or that faction. But what has been accompanied or has been collected, all the information and evidence in this file clearly shows that the entire regime, the entirety of the regime were involved. Based on our own information, the decision had been made at the Supreme Security Council headed by Hassan Rouhani and approved by Khamenei. And then it was assigned to the Ministry of Intelligence in close cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to conduct the operation. And indeed, today, the judge went through all these elements, particularly about the role of first the Ministry of Intelligence, which he said Assadi is a senior officer of the Ministry of Intelligence, but he was not acting on his own behalf. Everything was coming from Tehran. And indeed, again, the judge said the bomb was made in Iran, it was tested in Iran, and it was brought from Tehran by Assadi to Europe, and then delivered to the two other bombers in order to blow up the Free Iran gathering on June 2018. And the judge again emphasized on the fact that this was a very crowded rally. And had they succeeded, the casualties would have been really high. And he rejected the claims made by some of the defendants that they didn't know exactly the strength of the bomb, or they thought that this is a firework, and this kind of excuses. And he said this was a terrorist act with the intention of mass killing. And I think 3 or 4 times during this summary of the ruling, he emphasized on mass killing and intention to inflict as much casualty as possible. So the evidence is undeniable. Also, he referred to investigation done by the Belgian State Security Services, which they also concluded that this decision or the planning of this terrorist act was done in Iran, and Assadi was acting on behalf of the state of Iran, not just his own personal initiative. So, and he went through, in fact, every single argument that both Assadi's lawyer and other lawyers have made. With regard to Assadi's lawyer, which his main defense was immunity, the judge reiterated the decision already made by courts in Belgium and Germany, and he said, this is absolutely nonsense. The international law is based on the sovereignty of nations. Vienna Convention doesn't provide any means for terrorists to engage in this kind of activities and then claim immunity. Indeed, this was an issue that back in November and December, when I had the opportunity to speak to the court, I said to the court that what they're asking is not immunity. They are asking for impunity in order to be able to continue with these terrorist activities in Europe. So that fact was well established, that it was state terrorism. Another part that he emphasized, and it should be part of the ruling, it is part of the ruling, was the fact that how the Iranian regime or how these people used diplomatic privileges as a facilitator for their operation, which again highlights the fact that within the system, whether you are from the Ministry of Intelligence or Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the tasks are the same. And this, I think, in my view, is a good reminder, particularly to the Europeans and whoever wants to engage in negotiation with this regime, that their interlocutor, Javad Zarif, is the same person who was, as a member of the Supreme National Security Council, responsible for the decision to conduct these terrorist activities. And as a foreign minister, he provided the full facilities of his embassies and diplomatic privileges in order that the operation will be conducted. So that's the interlocutor of the European and others in their negotiation. So I think that was well established during the court today. And also another point which the judge referred to was the terrorist network of the Iranian regime. And he said that the network run by Assadi must have been more extensive because there were others who were on the payroll of Assadi, which is the payroll of the Iranian regime. And he referred to some of the receipts found in the car and confiscated from Assadi, which he had given the monthly salaries of other agents of the regime during that few days trip that he had to Germany, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So that is a very, very important issue, which tell us that we are not talking about a terrorism that occurred in the past, but we are talking about an operation which is still ongoing, because that terrorist network, that terrorist apparatus is still there, is still operating. Okay, 3 or 4 of them have been arrested and convicted of terrorism, but the task of the European countries, and I think the same in the United States, because this network doesn't just belong to Europe, but they have it all over the world, including the United States. I think a major practical task for all governments is to really take this serious and do everything possible to destroy this terrorist network. And I tell you one thing, in addition to any practical measure, what is very vital is the right policy in order to destroy this network. And I remember back in 1997, when the court in Berlin in Germany ruled and said that the Iranian regime's top officials were one way or the other involved in that act, although none of them was sitting on the trial. But for several years, the Iranian regime had to back down because they have been warned that if they continue with their terrorist attacks, then there will be some tough responses from the European Union. So I believe now it is important, whether in the United States or in Europe, to take this matter very seriously and make sure that the right policy is adopted, because the experience has been, when you make concessions to dictators, particularly the mullah's regime, then they will get more emboldened and will continue with their terrorist attacks, whether in Europe, belligerence in the region, or even their nuclear ambition to have nuclear weapons. So really, I think the judicial system in Europe, in particular in Belgium, they have sort of completed their task with a clear conviction of the four terrorists and a clear message that it was not just some rogue elements, some individuals, but the Iranian state, that means the Iranian regime who was behind this terrorist act. Now is really the time for European governments, as well as the United States, to take the appropriate position, take the appropriate measures in order to confront the regime malign behavior, whether in the field of terrorism or their human rights violation in Iran. So having said that, I really believe that this was a turning point, and it is time for the world to recognize that this is a rogue regime. This is a regime that is in power only through suppression at home and export of terrorism and extremism abroad, and to recognize really the desire of the Iranian people for regime change by the Iranian people and their own resistance. This is really the only solution for peace and stability in that region, because so long as this regime is in power, based on the past experience, nothing would change. However, we hope that with this verdict, now the governments would do their part and really put aside the past policy of 40 years and adopt a new policy. I thank you all for giving me this opportunity, but later on, if there is any question, I would be glad to respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farzin. Appreciate that for your elaborate presentation about really what happened in the court. You talked about the overwhelming evidence that was referenced in the court verdict, but also by the prosecutors. If I may also take just a few minutes to show a few slides about the evidence that Farzin was talking about. And what we see here, this is a structure that he was talking about, the decision-making people about the attack in Paris, all the way from the Supreme Leader to the Supreme National Security Council headed by Hassan Rouhani. And then below that, you see the Mahmoud Alawi, the intelligence minister. And side by side the intelligence minister is actually Javad Zarif and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The two of them were tasked in carrying this out. The two are part and parcel of each other. And then you see the structure known as the appraisal section headed by Reza Lotfi, which is an entity within the Ministry of Intelligence, but is based in the Foreign Affairs Ministry. And he played a big role in all of the coordinations and everything. And you can see Assadi right there and the agents below him, clearly showing that this was a very elaborate, well-planned, coordinated effort by the Iranian regime. And here is actually, just to give you one example, these are the trips that Assad had made to Tehran in a matter of 4 years. There are 29 listed trips here. And in the very last one, on the 22nd of June, he brought with him the explosive, which was the TATP, the very powerful explosive that was used for that. And as you can see in this timeline, on the left side, June 22nd, that's when he brought the explosive on a diplomatic pouch. And then 4 days later, he drove this car with the bomb to Luxembourg, gave it to the two culprits. And then 2 days later, they put it in their Mercedes, drove back to Belgium. And then on the 30th of June, just as they were departing Belgium towards the Free Iran rally, they were caught with the bomb. And you can see the pictures on the right-hand side, how they tested the bomb, and it actually worked. They neutralized the bomb. And just give you one example of evidence. This is just what they found in Assadi's car. His car was like a mobile MOIS station. There were 2 red notebooks with instructions for the bomb, a green notebook with his travel details to 289 locations. He had 4 mobile phones to communicate with secret agents, 2 other phones for communicating, like hotels and other things they were doing. He had 2 different GPS devices, USB sticks containing the latest information gathered by those agents. And then he had receipts of payments he had made to 3 other agents who we still haven't been able to identify, a laptop containing 6 intelligence equipment training booklets, 2 external hard disks, 4 other USB disks, 2 other SD cards, various notes containing information, including the money paid to the couple. And then, as Farzin said, $30,000, euro cash at hand. And just look at the trips he had made. For someone stationed as a 3rd secretary in the embassy in Austria, in 11 European countries he traveled, 288 times, 40% of them were in Germany. That's why the Germans are now so focused to find out about his network there and all the other people he's been running. These are just to give you an idea about the documents that were confiscated. You see his own handwriting that came out of the red book and some of them from the green book, that he had instructions for how to operate the bomb and everything. The lower left side is the SMS communication he had with the would-be bombers. And the last one, he said, the bombers tell him, we played the game, Nassimeh learned it, should we get going? And he says, God bless you, bye. So, and then after that, he just kept asking them, what happened? Of course, they were all arrested, he didn't know. So just to give you an idea that, Farzi talked about the Minister of Foreign Affairs, we talked about Assadi, but that's not the only thing he has been running. You heard about the case of a similar terror plot in Albania, just a few months before that, in March of 2018, where Mrs. Rajiv was the keynote speaker. There were many others there, including Americans. And Ghulam Hossein Mohammad-Nia, who had been stationed there since 2016, along with 3 other diplomats, were expelled by the Albanian government for their involvement in this terror plot. They wanted to truck bomb the place. And who is Mohammad-Nia? Look at this picture. I think this picture speaks 1,000 words. That's Mohammad-Nia, part of the nuclear negotiating team of Iran in 2014, 2015, sitting across from the American delegation. So when we talk about the foreign ministry, engagement in diplomacy, their diplomacy is none other than what you see here. So having said that, I just want to, you saw the evidence, and I want to remind the journalists who have joined us to really feel free to post your questions as we go forward. We will get to them once the panel members make their opening remarks. Now we're going to go to the Honorable Tom Ridge, former Secretary of Homeland Security and former Governor of Pennsylvania. Governor, you've been to so many of these events in the past. We'd like to hear your thoughts, both about the verdict, about the regime's terror network, but also your recommendations for the Biden administration, which I'm sure they will be eager to hear your thoughts. Governor, please.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you and to join my colleagues on this panel. A couple of thoughts I'd want to share. First of all, I think the United States and the EU, and frankly, freedom-loving nations around the world who have embraced the notion of accountability and the rule of law owe an incredible debt of gratitude to the people of Belgium, their judicial system, their security service for their courage, for their thoroughness in this investigation. I mean, some of the information that you just shared in that presentation shows you the depth of the investigative effort, and certainly substantiates the lengthy and powerful opinion of the judge. And we'd also say, and we can probably sadly predict, that they will pay there'll be consequences, there'll be retribution, there'll be retaliation. And I think the judge and The security people who were assigned to investigate this case understand it fully, but they accepted and embraced the notion that as a country committed to the rule of law, that it was fundamental for them to proceed according to the rules of evidence that they have in their judiciary system and to render a verdict. And obviously it was a very powerful verdict. And frankly, a reminder to the rest of the world that when this conduct has been assessed, that they have now again validated something that many, both within the community within Iran and those who have followed the path of the mullahs in Iran and this theocracy for the past 30 or 40 years, that was a state-sponsored terrorist act. And that reprehensible act isn't the first, but there's a series of acts over the past 30 or 40 years that we need to remind ourselves that demonstrate once and again that this is a country that has acted with impunity, audacity, arrogance, certainly inconsistent with even basic norms of a civil society, totally repudiation of any basic sense of human rights, and a consistent engagement in the broader global community to bring chaos and disruption to advance its own ends. And I couldn't help but think that this verdict by the court somewhat reminded me of a phrase that Shakespeare used and has been used often in both literary and political arenas since he wrote it: the truth will out. The truth is, this is a pariah state. The truth is, over the past 40 years, they've acted that way. And I just decided to run through just a quick list of those actions, just to remind those who are observing and listening that can be attributed to this theocracy, this terrorist state. We know that this is just the most recent terrorist event, but they've exported terrorism throughout Europe on multiple occasions. We know they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps in excess of billions of dollars, in the Middle East, supporting Hamas and Hezbollah in order to keep that cauldron boiling with anxiety and unrest. We know they have supported proxies in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Iraq. We know that internally they have killed 30, 40,000 men and women who disagreed with the policies, the internal policies, the repressive policies of the Iranian government. We know they've imprisoned and tortured literally thousands and thousands of more individuals. We know they've had promoted plots in Africa and in Africa and South America. They've had the audacity to threaten international shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf, even challenging US naval vessels. We know they've continued to advance their ballistic missile research, and certainly in the past couple of years begun to enrich plutonium. This on top of being the primary state sponsor of terrorism globally, something that President Bush referred to in the State of the Union address, I think it was in 2002. And I'm reminded when I took a look at that address, he condemned the regime at that time for aggressively pursuing weapons of mass destruction and describing the leadership of the regime as, quote, an unelected few seeking to repress the Iranian people's hopes for freedom. And those hopes for freedom have been promoted aggressively. They've been able to sustain it through all the challenges, diplomatic, across the board. Those hopes have been best expressed by the NCRI. And I think that there is no action that countries who will repudiate and condemn. Now, there'll be a lot of international repudiation and condemnation of the Iranian government, that's fine. But actions certainly speak louder than words. And I don't think there's any action that those countries who have the courage to repudiate and condemn the Iranian government for this state-sponsored, I'm going to say that again, not a rogue group, state-sponsored act of terrorism, and to repudiate its terror and repression over the decades. I think the most powerful and most meaningful act of all, to align themselves, if they want to align themselves, as President Bush said, with the hopes and aspirations of the Iranian people, their hopes for freedom, the most important and meaningful thing they can do, and I'm sure there's a long list of things I'd personally like them to see them to do, but probably the most prominent and meaningful was simply recognize the NCRI as the embodiment of the hopes and aspirations of the Iranian people for freedom. So I appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts with you and look forward to the comments of my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Governor, for your insight, and appreciate the fact that, of course, today we talked a lot about the threat and the conviction, but you also talked about the solution and the hope and the future for Iran. That's very well appreciated. I know at some point you may have to leave earlier, and but before that, I would like to now ask Senator Torricelli, who was present at the event. I guess you are pleased, Senator, with the outcome as a civil party to this case. So we are interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Ali Raza, very much. Let me join with Tom Ridge. It is an extraordinary confirmation of the skill of the German, Belgian, Luxembourg, and French police authorities. An incredible statement in this jury about the integrity of the Belgian judicial process and the strength and character of people who, under threats of intimidation and retribution, nevertheless held firm to the rule of law. I don't think enough praise can be given to the law enforcement judicial authorities of each of those countries. My highest praise. I also think that it's hard to overstate the significance of what might have happened here today. The bar of outrage in the world has been lowered so much by so many events that we tend to take many events in passing that previously would have been noted for their historic significance. In the history of the Iranian regime, however it may evolve, today is a day of considerable significance. Let's think for a moment what's happened here. A sovereign nation, a member of the United Nations, that has diplomatic relations with a broad spectrum of nations in the European community, has had diplomatic agents in its service found guilty of conspiring and the act of committing a terrorist act in the heart of Europe. That's an extraordinary event. It's an extraordinary event. Using diplomatic channels and personnel on the soil of Europe, in the heart of Germany and Austria and Belgium, to kill, potentially, scores of people. I don't know how tomorrow morning the heads of government in Europe that have ambassadors of the Iranian regimes in their capital, clearly part of this network which has now been exposed, continue as if nothing has happened. Today is different than yesterday. The idea that the Ministry of Intelligence in Tehran and the Foreign Ministry are legitimate governmental enterprises is now impossible to consider. The events of today make a mockery of the fact that these relationships are maintained. And every head of Europe has some serious thinking to do about allowing cultural attaches, military attaches, diplomatic personnel who are now exposed as part of this network to continue to operate in their countries. Let me also pause for a moment to consider, what if the skill of German and Belgian and French authorities had not broken this network? What if the bomb, which was successfully transported from Tehran to Europe, had exploded as planned? I was at that rally that day in June of 2018. but so was the former Prime Minister of Canada, cabinet ministers of Britain, Germany, France, Italy, the United States, the former Foreign Minister of France, members of parliament from almost every member of the European Community and the United States Congress, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and high military officers of the United States Army. What if the bomb had exploded? The target may have been to assassinate Mrs. Rajavi, to murder her, but almost certainly many of the people that I've just identified would have been killed as well. What then? To those who would overlook the events of this prosecution, this verdict, what then? Because to do nothing to maintain diplomatic relationships, to allow the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to, in fact, to allow Zarif himself to enter Europe, to engage in negotiations in the face of what might have been, is to ignore reality. A lot of people have a lot of decisions to make after today's verdict, and it begins with the Biden administration. I will confess to you personally, John Kerry has been a personal friend of mine through most of my adult life. I sat with him on the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate for years. He has my highest admiration. But to see a photograph of him sitting across a table from Minister Zarif, when knowing that on that table was one of those found guilty today, who would have been my murderer, is more than a little chilling. And I know John well enough to know that it has to be chilling to him to know who was at that table. And indeed, if the intention of the Biden administration is to re-engage with Iran on the nuclear accords, there's some serious thinking to do here. Who's going to be at that table? Zarif? His agents? Those who may have been in those notebooks in this conspiracy about whom we now have information? The very people who made the decisions to send this weapon to Europe to kill us? There's some serious thinking to do. Maybe in the context of the Obama administration, reaching a nuclear accord with Iran absent consideration of their ballistic missile tests, absent their funding of terrorist activities throughout the Middle East, absent the assassination attempt in Albania, absent today's events and the assassination attempts and mass murder that would have happened in Paris, maybe then it made sense. Does it now? Can it possibly be in the interest of the United States? Can it possibly be legitimate and justified to re-enter those discussions and enter that accord without consideration of the broader military and terrorist activities of the Iranian government and the individuals now held responsible? Indeed, for whatever our partisan differences might be, can there really be any doubt that the actions of the previous administration in holding the Iranian government, the Revolutionary Guards, responsible and to sanction them has legitimacy? And not only should be maintained, but now strengthened. The court has spoken in Belgium, and European police authorities have acted. Now the burden falls upon the political leaders of Europe and the new Biden administration in particular. That's our responsibilities as Americans, as Europeans. And finally, there's a question for the Iranian people. You did not choose this government in Iran. It has been thrust upon you. And you've paid a price by thousands who have been executed and killed. And you've lost a generation of prosperity and freedom for your people. But ultimately, all of us are responsible for the actions of our governments, even if we did not choose them. They act in our name. The government in Tehran is a terrorist regime. As it has terrorized your people, it has terrorized the world. And by whatever means is necessary, the burden of history falls upon you to remove it. There are brave Iranians all throughout Iran who have taken to the streets and paid a price. There are Iranians in the diaspora all around the world, now coordinated by the MEK, the National Council of Resistance, and Mrs. Rajavi, taking a stand for regime change. I'm afraid the burden also falls upon you. This regime must fall. And all of you, wherever you are in Iran, can play a role, as all of these leaders now throughout Europe, North America, must think about their roles in light of this extraordinary decision today in Europe. Ali Raza, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you briefly.
Thank you so much, Senator, for your great remarks and key points. I think in one word, what I can summarize what you said is today is different than yesterday, and it has to change everywhere in terms of how they handle things, how they do business, how they do policy, both in Europe and the United States. And that's certainly for sure well understood. And of course, this regime must go, as you said. Definitely, that's perhaps one of the reasons, or maybe the main reason that the regime targeted this event and targeting the resistance, because they were having that impact. Now, before I go to Ambassador Joseph, I want to just remind everyone that we're joined by hundreds of people all over the United States. These are people who've been at the event with their family members, with their friends, and that's why today is a very, very important day for all of them. And they feel that at least after some 40 years, justice, at least when it comes to the conviction of the court, is actually done. Now, before I go to Ambassador Joseph, I want to say that he too, Ambassador Joseph, was also a civil party to this case. He was also present there. Ambassador Joseph, we'd like to hear your thoughts. And I have a few questions. I want to know if we can maybe incorporate some of these things in your points there, asking what do you think is the overall implication of this case on US-Iran policy, and what about Europe? If you are able to put that into your talks as well, I appreciate that. Ambassador, please.
Good morning, Ali Reza, and congratulations to you, to Farzin, and of course to Mrs. Rajavi and the entire NCRI family. This is truly a historic day. It's also a day of total vindication for the NCRI and for the cause of a free Iran. Following Senator Torricelli is never easy. Following the senator and Governor Ridge makes it a particularly significant challenge for me, as both of those individuals stand out as true American statesmen and patriots, and I thank them for their many, many contributions. What I'd like to do is comment on what is often called the so what question. In this case, the question before us is what action policymakers should take in light of what we have learned from the trial and now from the verdicts of Assadi, the terrorist diplomat, and his 3 accomplices. At the risk of repeating what has already been said, I think it's important to start with the principal findings that were presented by the prosecution, as they provide the proper context for the so what question. In short, they are: first, this was a deliberate act of state terrorism ordered by and conducted by the Iranian regime. Assadi, the principal defendant, was found to be a senior official of the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, assigned to the Iranian embassy in Vienna and masquerading as a diplomat. Second, Assadi was not acting alone. He was not a rogue agent. He was in regular contact with higher level officials in Tehran, receiving his orders from them. He took personal possession of the bomb, which had been transported on a commercial airline from Tehran, and designed by professionals to cause maximum damage, maximum death, maximum destruction of those attending the convention in Paris. Third, Assadi, using his diplomatic status as a cover for his criminal activities, had been running a network of agents in Europe from his position in the embassy. And there can be no doubt that his true identity was known within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, making the MFA complicit in this terrorist act. As was stated, this is the first time that an Iranian regime official has been caught red-handed in and convicted of an act of state-sponsored terrorism. This brazen act reflects the desperation of a regime that has lost all credibility, all legitimacy with the Iranian people. Through the mass murder of over 100,000 of its own citizens from the 1980s until today, through pervasive corruption, through foreign aggression in support of dictators such as Assad in Syria, through the bankrolling of terrorist groups, and through what is now proven to be direct acts of terrorism in Europe and around the globe. This religious dictatorship has squandered the wealth of the Iranian nation, and as the governor pointed out, turned a great nation into a pariah state. Now that the verdict has been handed down, the judiciary has finished its work. It's now time for the government to act decisively, knowing that further concessions to the regime will only bring more injustice to the Iranian people and more criminal and terrorist acts. For the EU, this should mean the adoption of a firm policy, including the designation of the MOIS and IRGC as terrorist entities, as Mrs. Rajavi has stated, withdrawing the legal status of all of the regime's agents in Europe, and dramatically reducing the level of diplomatic relations until the regime has demonstrated its commitment to forego terrorist activities. For the Biden administration, the guilty verdicts of Assadi and his accomplices should weigh very heavily in its review of Iran policy. This act of state terrorism should have a sobering effect. It should end any move to resurrect the appeasement policies of the past and dispel any false nostalgia about working with Foreign Minister Zarif as a moderate influence within the regime, as he, with no doubt, was aware of the attempted attack by MOIS operatives working under his auspices. And I say no doubt because the attempted bombing of the Paris Convention fits an established pattern of using embassies and diplomats stationed in Europe and elsewhere to plan and execute terrorist operations. As Ali Reza has just recalled, the expulsion of Iran's ambassador to Albania and his deputy for their role in planning a terrorist attack on the MEK residence at the New Year's celebration in 2018, again with Mrs. Rajavi as the primary target. Here I would just add that, as was pointed out, the ambassador was previously a member of Iran's negotiating team resulting in the JCPOA, and that the agreement was still in effect with the United States at the time of the intended attack. Targeting a massive crowd to pursue the criminal objective of killing the leader of the democratic opposition is a horrific crime that cannot be tolerated by any civilized government. The new administration must uphold the values that it espouses. If the leaders of free societies fail to hold the perpetrators responsible, including at the highest levels in Tehran, it will only encourage more terrorist acts and make us complicit in them. I'll end on a personal note, something I normally don't do, but I think it reaffirms the message that we're all sending today. I had the opportunity to lead the discussions, the negotiations with Libya over its nuclear weapons program, discussions that resulted in the Libyan program literally being packed up and brought back to Tennessee, along with their long-range missiles. I know Libya is not Iran. Let me say that again. Libya is not Iran, just as Iran is not North Korea. They're all different, they're all unique, but they do have common elements. And one common element is the nature of the regime. These are regimes that conduct diplomacy through blackmail, through hostage taking, and through acts of terror. That does not mean that you don't deal with them, but it does mean that you must take into account whom you are dealing with. The Libyan delegation across the table from me was led by a rather urbane ambassador from the foreign ministry. He was supported by the head of external intelligence, a very cosmopolitan individual who had attended university in Michigan, and by the way, would later become foreign minister. Others came from the military and Gaddafi's personal staff. While it may have been tempting to see at least the first two individuals as more sophisticated, as more refined, as more like us, particularly when we talked about world events or Michigan football, I never for a moment forgot that this regime, and likely these very officials, were responsible for the murder of hundreds of Americans in the Pan Am 103 bombing. It simply doesn't matter what role these individuals play in the regime at any given time, or where they went to school, or how well spoken they may be. They are inseparable and they are complicit in the regime's crimes. If they weren't, you wouldn't be dealing with them. Foreign Minister Zarif proves the rule. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Joseph, for your great thoughts and also your personal experience. Certainly that's should be taken into account, given your experience over the years. Now, I'm going to go to Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield Jr. Ambassador, you were in Lebanon in 1983 when the Iranian regime bombed the Marine barracks, and also as Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. You've been following the Iran regime's behavior and seen its terrorism firsthand. What's your reaction, and what's the maybe top 3 recommendations you have for the Biden administration? I want to incorporate a couple of questions I have here, both in terms of, of course, the regime has been doing terrorism over the years. How different is the court ruling, and why it's having a different impact, and what's the difference, if you can highlight that. Please, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, Ali Reza, and greetings to my friend Farzin Hashemi. I'm honored to be joined by these distinguished panelists, and greetings to all who are watching in the United States, fellow Americans of Iranian heritage and or not, to the journalists who are watching, to those in Europe, and to the Iranian people who may be tuning in. I won't repeat what we've heard. I think this is a seminal event. What we have seen is that the law enforcement and criminal justice authorities in several European countries have had to deal with Iranian terrorist activity, from Albania to Austria to Germany, France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Denmark, Netherlands, possibly other countries. That is a lot of activity, and it's recent activity. As Bob Joseph just said, the bombing threats in both France and Albania were done before President Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA. We were in full compliance. The agreement was in full effect, and yet they were still planning and conducting terror activities. So that pattern has been well established. I second everything we've heard from our distinguished fellow panelists. The other aspect is the deception involved. What did Foreign Minister Zarif say? What is he still saying? Oh, this was a false flag operation. It couldn't possibly have been the Tehran regime. Of course, that's been proven to be false. But this is what he said. He said the MEK was going to blow up its own people and its own supporters around the world. And by the way, that sounds familiar because in June of 2019, when Japan's Foreign Minister Abe showed enough respect to go to Tehran and meet with the supreme leader, hoping to defuse tensions, a Japanese tanker in Abu Dhabi was bombed by the Revolutionary Guards. And what did Zarif say? Oh, it's got to be a false flag operation. I mean, what kind of regime would possibly do such a thing? Indeed. And so now, having done these acts of terror, by the end of 2019, he had the audacity to show up at the G7 meeting in Biarritz, expecting to have a private meeting with the President of the United States, after all that we now know he was involved in. And now, if you read Foreign Affairs Journal or distinguished Journal of Foreign Affairs. He's lecturing America on the need to abide by international law. So let's take account of this. Iran has been engaged in an unending pattern of terrorism, as your panelists have said, for 35 straight years. Not once has their #1 status been challenged by any other state in the world. At some point, the United States has to realize that it has tried very hard to make gesture after gesture to Iran. We have a foreign service that wants to go back into Iran and establish a Persian culture and the full embassy diplomatic relations after the hostage crisis. We have non-proliferation experts who want to deal with a nuclear threat. These are understandable impulses, and I respect those. But let's look back. In the 1980s, we gave them arms for hostages. What good did it do us? In the 1990s, the State Department put the MEK and the NCRI on the terrorism list to try to send a gesture to the new president, Khatami, not realizing that terror at home and the nuclear program were proceeding behind the scenes. The FBI was never even consulted on putting the NCRI and the MEK on the terrorism list. So it was not about terrorism. In the 2000s, the US military deposed unfriendly regimes to Tehran in both Baghdad and in Kabul. And we tried to negotiate in good faith on the newly discovered secret nuclear weapons program, by the way, revealed by the NCRI. Iran deceived us, and they've bragged about Rouhani saying that he deceived us and bought more time, which led to some strong UN sanctions at the end of that decade. And then in the past decade, the 2010s, what did we do? We sat for 2 years with the Iranians, with the rest of our European, with Russia, the P5+1, to try to come in good faith to some terms on these issues. The Iranians compelled us to throw in the end of the arms embargo and to end the UN restriction, the prohibition on ballistic missile development, which the previous administration did, the Obama administration. They wanted cash they wanted all of their frozen funds with interest. All of these things were given to them. And what did we see after the JCPOA? We saw an increase in repression at home and terror abroad. The conclusion is inescapable that for 41 years, this regime has always acted in bad faith. They're still attacking us through proxies around the world. They're undermining UN mediation efforts in Yemen and Syria. They're funding terror against Israel. And now, once again, they're aiming the nuclear gun at the rest of the world, saying, drop everything. The breakout time is closing fast. And they're trying to sort of hold us hostage to forget about everything we've been talking about today. So what can the US do? I have 3 suggestions. Number 1, we can and we should launch a comprehensive counterintelligence investigation in the United States aimed at Iranian agents of influence. If you were following the news in January, an academic Iranian exile was arrested in Boston. He's published op-eds in the New York Times, but for 14 years, he's been on the payroll of the Iran regime, undeclared. Do you really think he's the only one in the United States? We need to do that, and I've been calling for that for years. Secondly, an initiative that has no relation to the nuclear talks. So the US, Europe, Canada, and others should be able to join together to conduct a comprehensive human rights investigation of major crimes tied to leading regime figures. The 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, we now have evidence, we have proof, we have witnesses. All of this is now available, and the UN is starting to take note. We should press for justice on this. The Argentina bombings in the 1990s, a long time ago, but the investigator in Argentina, Alberto Nisman, was murdered in 2015, the night before he was going to reveal his findings. Does anyone think Iran had nothing to do with that? We should pursue it. Even the bombings of the US Embassy and the Embassy Annex and the US Marine Barracks in the early 1980s, where I was the country director for Lebanon in the Pentagon, were done by an individual who is now still a high-ranking official of the Iran regime. So the guilty are still there. The witnesses and evidence are available. Does anyone think that the Iran regime has less blood on its hands than the leaders of the former Yugoslavia, who sit in jail at The Hague, convicted by the International Court of Justice? We've got to start working now collectively with other like-minded nations, starting in Europe, to prepare those dossiers. This has no connection to nuclear talks. And third, we need, as my fellow panelists have said, a comprehensive strategy to end 41 years of terrorism. We need to think out of the box. We need new tools and new strategies. You know, we haven't talked to the Europeans, the Gulf states, Israel, about their experiences, their concerns. I think this is the time for a multinational conversation. We're now hearing that the Biden administration will step up efforts to mediate an end to the Yemen conflict. How about a higher level effort to support the good efforts of my friend Jim Jeffrey, that was not backed very much in Washington, to try to implement Resolution 2254. This is a resolution that was unanimously passed by the UN Security Council after the JCPOA was agreed in 2015, mandating a credible, inclusive governance, a transition to a new constitutional government in Syria. The clerics of Iran have told each other, and we know this, that if Assad regime were no longer there, the Tehran regime would be severely weakened. Let's have a new strategy. Let's have some new tools. Let's root out the information operations in our midst. Let's bring the guilty to justice for crimes against humanity and war crimes. Let's start to look at what keeps this terror regime thriving in the Middle East and around the world. And let's remember that what they did and what they almost did, and I was in the hall as well, is no different than what ISIS has been doing in Europe, exploding massive bombs, mass casualty events. Look at the policy on ISIS and ask yourself, what can we do with Iran? And this, again, has nothing to do with the JCPOA. So I commend these ideas and others to my fellow panelists and to those who are listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bloomfield. You gave a track record of Javad Zarif and his ministry and also his predecessors over the years, how they have conducted diplomacy, which was in fact using terrorism, coercion, blackmail, and threatening others and hostage taking. And this is the latest example as what we saw today. But you also had very interesting and solid recommendations, especially when you said the counterintelligence operations that needs to be done here in this country. If Assadi had dozens and dozens of agents operating all over Europe, the question is, who are the agents of the Ministry of Intelligence who work in collaboration with their mission in New York? Remember, Ghulam Hossein Mohammad Nia was based in New York at their mission and contacting a lot of agents and others. And that you mentioned that those identification by the law enforcement need to be pursued, and also having a comprehensive strategy, new tools, and new strategy. Certainly, we look forward to that. Now, last but not the least, Ambassador Mark Ginsberg. Ambassador, you have been in the White House during the Carter administration. You worked for Senator Edward Kennedy. You worked in the campaign of President Clinton, and in Al Gore 2000, you were part of the campaign. You were national security spokesperson. What do you see the impact of this ruling today? And perhaps your recommendations for the Biden administration, because I've gotten a few emails, questions that talk about the impact, how this should impact the any attempt or negotiations with the Iran regime, particularly when it comes to the nuclear issue or other aspects of that. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ali Reza, and let me thank all my fellow panelists, because they've all put forward some excellent recommendations. Of course, it's this decision by the Belgian court should be a watershed moment here in the United States, particularly at this time. And my respect and admiration for those who helped bring the prosecution, and of course, those, including Farzin, who participated in ensuring this verdict. But since I'm the last, I do not want to take too much time because I know there's some questions. I particularly wanted to focus on Senator Torricelli's important recommendations, because this is where we are. And I want to speak as honestly as I can with respect to my friends in the Biden administration. The JCPOA under the Obama administration was viewed not by both sides as almost a get out of jail card for the Iranian regime. Money flowed, there was hopes and expectations of engagement. Mr. Zarif became sort of a celebrity here in the United States. And we saw what that resulted in. For all of the great expectations and hopes of the Obama administration involving secret negotiations, hopes that the regime would moderate as we entered this JCPOA, well, the facts basically are very clear. The JCPOA provided more time to the Iranian regime to be able to find ways to violate sanctions, to gain more currency. I'm talking about hard currency and diplomatic currency, to engage in more terrorism, to increase its ability to harm our allies abroad, to plot more terrorist attacks in the United States, as well as to, in effect, begin and continue to plan its own Iran nuclear weapons program under the very eyes of inspectors. So for all of the hype of the JCPOA, by all of the people who've rejoined the Biden administration, from Secretary Kerry to Wendy Sherman and to others, and from the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, which maybe have been as noble an enterprise as it possibly could have been, but actually did not succeed, because Iran has once again proven that it is not going to be in any way, shape, or form undermined in its mission to promote and export terrorism and to continue its nuclear weapons program. So here's some words of advice, basically taken from the president and his advisor's own words. Just a few days ago, the president appointed Robert O'Malley to be his senior point man on Iran. Now, Mr. O'Malley was involved in helping to shepherd what essentially was the efforts to engage this regime, the Iranian regime, under the Obama administration. The Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, a close friend of mine, has made it very clear that he does not want whatever may represent a new strategy to Iran to be another choir of appeased audiences that wish to basically somehow create an iron curtain between a re-entry into a JCPOA and all of the terrorist activities and malign activities that Iran engaged in. I recall that when Mr. Kerry and his team were forced to confront the arguments made by the Israelis and others, how could you enter into this agreement given Iran's adverse and malign behavior elsewhere? And his response was, we'll get to that. We'll get to their ballistic missile program. We'll get to their terrorism. This is an important first step to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear program. Well, that strategy and that reasoning can no longer apply. I'm not sure that I understand what we have to gain by entering into a new nuclear agreement that isn't substantially changed from a prior agreement with respect to sunset provisions, with respect to the ballistic missile program, with respect to its acts of terrorism, with respect to not permitting it to gain more financial support as a result of reentry. The real problem in the last negotiation is that Iran set the terms of our willingness to negotiate with it. That can no longer be the Biden administration strategy. And so I do recommend that all of these proposals that have been tabled here need to be sent front and center and hold Mr. Malley and Secretary of State Blinken to their own word, that this administration wants to hear from those who are not necessarily prepared to agree to this approach, that he wants to hear from all voices. So we have a responsibility to take all these recommendations and, most importantly, to ensure that Congress, as well as our allies, as well as those within the Biden administration that are very skeptical about reentry to a JCPOA on prior terms, need to have all the ammunition and all the evidence they need to ensure that this does not happen again. Thank you very much, and glad to be with everybody.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ginsberg. You certainly had your own recommendations for the administration, and I already included some of the questions we've gotten in the email. What I want to do before wrapping up, and I want ask every member of the panel to give, like, in 1 minute, your bottom line and really your takeaway of this, and specifically if you can give a constructive advice to the administration, if you can condense it in 1 minute. And I want to start with Secretary Ridge, if he's still available before he goes. If not, I want to go to Ambassador Bob Joseph. Yes, Ambassador Joseph, yes.
Thank you, Ali Reza. Well, I think what we have all underlined is that the regime in Tehran represents a massive evil. It is a regime that cannot, by its own behavior over the course of decades, it's a regime that cannot reform itself. The regime is not going to change. What must change is the international community's response to that regime. And the United States must lead that response. And we must lead it in a very realistic, open-eyed manner. We must understand the dynamics of this regime, the roots of the evil of this regime, the methods of this regime, and we must mobilize through our own leadership and through our own means, a coalition that will stand up and represent not only the interests of our country and other countries, but the interests of the Iranian people. Because fundamentally, this goes to the issue of human rights and standing up for the principles that every administration, every American administration has articulated over the course of decades.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Joseph. And I want to get from Senator Torricelli. Senator, what's your 1 minute?
Well, I'll pick up because I agree with everything that Bob Joseph just said. Because the evidence is now incontrovertible that indeed this regime has not changed and it will not change. It is a terrorist government. The Biden administration is now left with a particular challenge. It is extremely difficult, I think, now for the Biden administration to re-engage with Tehran on re-entering the nuclear accords, given the evidence of their terrorist activities, attempts to kill American citizens. I think in the State Department and the National Security Council, there needs to be some very serious thinking about recalibrating what their intentions were before this verdict as they now go forward. Today is different.
Thank you so much, Senator, and I'm sure they will take your advice. And Ambassador Bloomfield, I know you did make your 3 recommendations, but if there's anything else you want to add, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ali Reza, and thanks to my colleagues. 2 quick points. One, it's my observation that there's been an enormous amount of partisanship on the issue of US-Iran. And it may fall, frankly, on the Trump administration for making this so much of a criticism of President Obama and personalizing it, which I think offended many people who served under President Obama. And now there might be an inclination to rebuke the Trump record. This partisanship is very convenient to Tehran. We need to put it aside. I will say this unequivocally. The Biden administration team is a very high quality, smart team. They're very capable. And when there's a nuclear threat, you have to do something about it. You can't ignore it. So I respect the way they've begun in a cautious manner. But here's what I recommend. We need to understand that Iran is not a normal country. We have to stop treating them as a normal sovereign country under the Westphalian system. We need to look at the history. Ayatollah Khomeini was a very different kind of power figure. He had his own agenda. He, you could argue, started the Iran-Iraq war with over 100 attacks in southern Iraq. As soon as they took over in the revolution, Khomeini's focus had nothing to do with the people of Iran other than controlling them through brute force, which he did, but to start looking at the Shia populations around the Middle East and to destabilize the Sunni world. This is what really happened. And when he died and Khamenei took over, he was a very weak leader that did not enjoy the same charisma or frankly carry the same kind of geopolitical ambition. And so this may be why they went to the nuclear program, to try to shore up a weak state, a weak regime. You can look at everything they've been doing as a defensive measure to delay the inevitable fall of this regime. And frankly, the Biden administration is facing people on the streets across the world, but in Hong Kong, in Russia, in Belarus, and in Iran. And it's the same issue, regimes which have lost their legitimacy. And so I think we need to think anew about this Iranian state and dispense with the normal niceties of state-to-state relations. Foreign Minister Zarif is completely discredited, and there have to be consequences. We need a new strategy. We need a broad new conversation on Iran.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Ambassador Ginsberg, your 1 minute.
There can no longer be an iron curtain imposed by the Biden administration at the behest of the Iranian regime to commence negotiations on a re-entry into a JCPOA. That iron curtain has to disappear with respect to all of the activities, the adverse activities of Iran, from its ballistic missile program, to its terrorism, to its human rights violations, to its interference with our allies around the world, to its terrorism in the United States. The most important thing is to get congressional support, bipartisan support, the support of everybody here to ensure that the Biden administration doesn't adopt the same policy of the Obama administration and permit the Iranians to dictate the terms of any further engagement. Every issue must be on the table for our satisfaction. And if the Iranians are not prepared to, shall we say, engage with the United States, we should say, hasta la vista.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador Ginsberg. And Farzin, your bottom line and your recommendations, please.
I think very excellent recommendations were just made by the distinguished panelists. What I can just add is for any administration to listen to the voices of the Iranian people. During the November 2019 protests and the previous year, they chanted very loud and clear their desire for regime change, for the entirety of this regime to go. So I think they should have in mind the desire of the Iranian people and not providing any assistance to the regime under any pretext, whether it is for preventing the regime to obtain nuclear or anything else. The real solution for Iran and for the region, for peace and stability in the region, is really a change of regime, because the experience of the past 40 years have proven that this regime cannot reform itself. So it's time to recognize the right of the Iranian people for change through their own efforts and their own resistance.
Thank you, Farzin. As you said, the voice of the people of Iran, and I think the court ruling echoed the chants of the people of Iran who said, reformers, hardliners, the game is now over. And I think this verdict should act exactly like that for the international community. I would like to sum up and really reiterate the position of the Iranian resistance as stated today by Mrs. Rajavi, that this is a historic ruling against the entirety of the regime and is a state-sponsored terrorism. All of the regime's embassies in Europe need to be shut down. Time to hold the Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif to account, as the Foreign Ministry has been consistently involved in terrorism. Hold the regime's leaders to account. They need to face justice. Agents of the Iran regime in Western nations must be identified, prosecuted, and expelled, as Ambassador Bloomfield elaborated very nicely. No refugee privilege given or citizenship for these agents, and any negotiations with the regime and the return to normal diplomatic status must be conditional on dismantling the mullah's terrorist network and ending the human rights violations in Iran. And as Ambassador Ginsberg said, the Iranian regime is a totality that all of the different aspects of it, they work in unison, as the court ruling showed today. So if you want to address the nuclear threat, you have to address the terrorism, the human rights violations, their proliferation, and the repression inside the country. With that, I want to thank all of the panel members for attending our event today. I want to thank everybody who was on our Zoom call, including the community members, the families who were present in the 2018 rally, and they are very jubilant today because of the court ruling. I want to congratulate all of you. I want to congratulate the people of Iran, the people of the United States, everywhere, because today is the victory for justice. And I think with that, our work has just begun to implement this further and eventually, as all of you highlighted, to see a free and democratic Iran. Thank you very much to all of you, and God bless you. Bye-bye.